All righty, everybody. This is the Engage HR podcast, and of course, it is brought to you by Engagedly, a progressive performance management tool and people enablement platform. What we discuss on this podcast is everything from performance to engagement to Aaron making horrible dad jokes, as always. I am your host, William Miller. Let's get started. So today's guest is Michael Haid. Michael has an extensive background, but I'm going to let Michael, of course, kind of disclose a little bit about himself. And I do have a special question for Michael after he does a little intro.
Well, thank you very much. So a little bit about myself. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which today is more like living in the rainforest because it's super hot, super humid. I've been in the profession of talent development, workforce strategy for about 30 years across 3 different consulting firms, international and global consulting firms. And I've started my own business, the Haid Group, which is really specializing in workforce alignment, creating workforce strategies for organizations, and doing a lot in the area of culture shift and assessment. So I'm happy to be here. Thanks for letting me join.
We're talking to you a little bit about culture today, but before we dive into that topic, as always, we have our special question, and it is a wordy one at that. And it is, what drink outside of water would you drink if it was the only drink you could drink for the rest of your life?
I'm going to say Arnold Palmer. And I'm cheating because that's a combination of lemonade and iced tea. So I'm actually getting 2 different types of drinks into that one drink question. So that's what I'd be happy with that, actually.
Strategic play. I like it.
It's a valid drink. You know, if it's got a name, Long Island iced tea, you know, any of those, they all work. They all work. The kind of first question here is, what is the first step to understanding the current company culture when you kind of look at a company?
The first place to start, and it may sound a little odd, but is to define culture. What is culture? If you're going to be looking at it, if you're going to be trying to shift it, and many, many organizations are looking to shift their culture now due to all kinds of the external factors that we're all dealing with, they often don't have a common definition of what culture means. So one of the very first steps for an organization to engage in is to define what it means and define it in a way that it can be operationalized, managed, measured, and changed. And I think that's one of the keys. Many organizations will pull some type of academic definition of culture and say, well, this is what we mean by culture. Or they'll say something like, it's the norms and the values that we ascribe to, or it's what we aspirationally try to achieve of behaviorally. And those definitions are somewhat theoretical. And what I'm talking about as a solid first step, if you're going to be seriously looking at your culture, you have to define it in ways that can actually be observed. So questions more around, how do we make decisions? What are the true priorities here? Is it our people? Is it our customers or clients? Or is it our bottom line? Oftentimes those things conflict. What takes priority when those things conflict? What gets rewarded? Working with a company, a telecom company, in just starting to define their culture, they defined themselves actually as an IT company, and they were ascribing to an IT type of culture. When I started to ask questions around what gets rewarded around here, because I wanted to bring it down to earth and make it real, like what does this culture actually feel like when you're living in it, when you're working in it? I found out that the sales team actually, when they did well, they got trips to islands, all-inclusive resorts on islands. When the IT team did really cool stuff, they got like a cupcake in the break room. So right away, there was a dissonance between how the organization was defining its culture and what was actually happening in the culture. So what gets rewarded is a very important first step in understanding what your culture is. Who makes decisions and how do they get made? And what are the priorities of the organization are all much better questions to start organizations down the path of defining a culture, which is the absolutely critical first step. Because you can't shift it, you can't manage it, you can't measure it if you haven't defined what it is.
So as you think about people and working with clients, how they work through that process, where do you see the most common mistakes happen when people are really trying to pull back the layers and understand their culture?
A couple things. One is it's an initiative driven out of HR or sponsored by one executive leader. And so that typically does not bode well for the whole initiative to really move a culture forward. One of the critical early on mistakes is, does the organization generally, and especially the leadership of the organization, really understand the importance of culture? Or do they understand it in a way that gives them competitive differentiation? Or do they think of it more as just sort of the people side of the business? It's fine for some folks in HR to sort of play around with that, but it's not that critical. They might give you lip service and say, oh, it's really important. Important to press them when they say, oh, it's really important, is why? Why do you think it's important? How is it making a difference in your bottom line, your top line, and your market share? Relate it back to some of the things they're trying to accomplish in the business to see, do they really understand the connection between the culture and their business strategy, or is that missing? And if that's missing, it's a huge mistake to move forward, because you're not gonna get anywhere. The initiative will eventually run out of gas, it'll run out of budget, it'll run out of funding, because people don't really understand the critical nature of culture in the life of a business. So that's probably the primary mistake I see organizations making, is not spending the time up front to make sure the people that are driving the culture really understand its importance.
I like the connection you make with the culture and the business strategy. That was very well said. Kind of those two things do directly relate to one another.
Who's driving culture? Hopefully before kind of we set sail into with a ship that's already got a bunch of holes in it. Who's typically driving culture, and how's that changed over the past decade or so?
It's really interesting because it has changed somewhat, just even accelerated over the last 5 years or so. It's not uncommon for a long tenured organization, multi-generations of leaders going through that, well-established, big footprint type of organizations, typically to have culture being driven from the top. And what's interesting is often top leaders don't understand that they're actually driving the culture. They're pronouncing what the culture should be to the rest of the organization, but they're not necessarily acting in coherence with that, and they don't necessarily understand what the disconnect between their behavior and their words does to a culture. More recently, in smaller organizations, startup organizations, more distributed network types of organizations, it's really a distributed culture. Almost everybody is driving the culture. It's not just residing with mid-level leaders on up. It's really the entire organization. And that's very true of small organizations. In family-owned businesses, which I've worked with myself, there's actually two cultures. The culture of the family that's in the business, and then the culture of the business that they want everybody else outside of the family to adhere to. It can come from different points depending on the type of organization that you're operating with.
There was so much about leadership and culture, right? You know, you talked about academics like Edgar Schein, right? Writes a whole book on leadership and culture, and how we set the tone from the top. And now that, when those two things are in running in parallel now, like the bottom part, distributed, more flat organizations, people setting the tone in the work that they do, and then leadership having it. What happens when there's dissonance? Like, have you seen instances in working with clients when there's like a difference between what the leadership sees as culture and then what we see is how it is like actually being operationalized at the team levels within these?
That's an actually very insightful question, because what that does is you have a very quick proliferation of subcultures. So if the culture that I'm supposed to ascribe to, I don't see my leaders living, so there's not a lot of integrity there, I will very quickly, in my sub-team or my group or my division or my geography, however we're split up, we'll create our own. And sometimes it will mirror what the aspirational culture is supposed to be that the leaders aren't behaving towards. Sometimes it'll take on a very different culture and be almost a counterculture to the ones that the leaders really wanted to establish but failed to do.
And when you bring up that point, a lot of times I think like these subcultures, do they create silos, right?
Yeah.
Within, and I think that's something to keep in mind. Like, if there is a subcultural element, but if we have too many subcultures, do we now create too many silos? Now, what was once a flat organization becomes a siloed organization. Does that happen? It's an interesting thing when we talk about these networks and how these networks start to define their own identity, which may not be aligned with each other.
And it impacts operational efficiency quite a bit when that siloing occurs, because the way we make decisions or our priorities over here aren't the way, and I have to partner with you for whatever reason across organizational boundaries. I don't understand your subculture, you don't understand mine. We're starting to turn a lot of clock cycles unnecessarily because we've developed these siloed cultures as you've described it. That's typically an outcome of that kind of an environment.
It's like all the subcultures kind of are like eating away at the foundation of like a good culture in a way almost, because you could just have all these like little ones kind of coming out of nowhere, kind of ruining the foundation of what you built, right?
That's true. And I've worked with organizations whose subcultures are so strong, it doesn't matter if the leaders come and go. The subculture of the organization is sustained over time, and the leaders are almost irrelevant to the culture itself. They might set the strategy or create some type of mandate for the organization, but that's about it.
I mean, they can strengthen though too, right?
Yeah.
So they can eat away, or they could like reinforce. Yes. So it's, you know, there's the good, the bad, the ugly of the subculture, right?
Where do you see companies as they move go wrong, and where do they experience the most challenges?
Typically, where they go wrong is they think a single shot initiative or a cluster of initiatives around talent management or leadership development are somehow going to change the culture without doing the upfront work to understand where the culture is, understand what has to remain, what has to change, really thinking through what the shift represents and how they're going to behavioralize that shift so that they can measure it and monitor it and see if it succeeds. You know, what's really current right now is a lot of diversity and inclusion initiatives. Those initiatives could be good. They could have great content, great asset. They could be delivered over really cool platforms in terms of what the employee is experiencing. But if the culture is not shifting truly towards an inclusive mindset, then that initiative, which was supposed to change the culture and move the culture forward, is probably doomed to fail. A classic example is organizations typically will want to shift to more innovative thinking. Mm-hmm. And if you ask senior leaders or those who are in charge with risk benefit management, what kind of mistakes will you allow? All of a sudden the room gets really quiet. Because if I'm trying to drive more innovation into my culture, I'm going to have a lot more risk tolerance while people experiment, because they're going to fail. Many times they'll fail stupendously before they succeed.
What is the role that leadership and managers, what role should they be playing, or can they play to help the process along?
That's a great question. And oftentimes they have to be actively involved. This is not a passive, spectator sport where we're going to mentor somebody and perhaps, in every once in a while to what we think is important. They have to be involved very much up front in that crucial link between how is culture tied to our business imperatives. They have to be able to articulate that. The thing I said at the outset of this podcast, they need to be involved with that. They need to articulate that. They need to see the importance of that connection. That's one critical way they need to be involved. The next way they need to be involved, and this is harder actually, is some of their behaviors may need to change, and they have to commit to that behavior change in front of each other, either virtually or in physical presence. And then they have to be able to know what's going on with the culture shift and reward when they see it shifting in the right direction, and sort of admonish people who are hanging on to the old culture, the things that they want to let go of. They have to be in a position to really manage people to see that the new things associated with the shift in culture are being recognized. We are noticing. We did notice your change in behavior, Aaron, and we actually think it was great. And just the fact of me noticing, being involved to that extent, is really incumbent on leaders and managers to successfully move a culture forward. Otherwise, you sort of go back into that world where, that's just, they say they want this, but no one's paying attention to what we're actually doing. So we're just going to do what we want anyway.
I feel like it's kind of like that first step, right? You want to be able to tell, like, you guys got to actually participate in these programs and get actively involved with your employees and engage with them to really show the effectiveness, or even change culture, or change mindsets even within the organization. When it comes to assessing the effectiveness of change initiatives related to culture, how do you see yourself doing that, or how do you see kind of, I guess, consultants or even organizations doing that?
Yeah, that has to really be baked into the organizational system. So one of the things that you'd want to look at is, can we change the performance management system if it needs it to accommodate some behavioral evidence. So not just results, did you hit your profit or your growth number, or this, that, or the other? But what kind of behaviors did you engage in? Can that be incorporated into the performance management review system in a way that's not going to be overly taxing for anybody? People are getting reviewed, and hopefully they're getting reviewed more than once a year. Hopefully it's an ongoing conversation throughout the year, right? Again, they can say, we noticed some changes in your behavior. Not only did you get great results numerically, but you did it the right way in terms of where we're trying to take our culture. So that's one place where it needs to be embedded in terms of how it gets measured, how it gets managed, how it gets moved forward. Another great thing to do is pulse surveys. Not huge, long 360s that are trying to track 6 behaviors for every competency, and there's 28 competencies in the model, but rather, what are those critical behaviors that we see moving the culture forward, even incrementally? And let's just do some pulse surveys on that and make sure we get back to the people with the results as soon as we have them. That's another good way to sort of keep things on track and keep things moving forward.
Working on the sales side of Engagely, you see a lot of paper processes coming our way, and you see some of these very traditional 360s, and you're like, people actually fill these out? Because they're just so long. They're so long and cumbersome that you're just scratching your head. You're like, wow, this just does not seem like it would work. So that's an extremely good point.
And then the results of those are somewhat suspect because we're all human. And if I'm filling those out for more than one person, I'm just going to start checking the middle box probably. There's a little suspicion around the results of those really sort of old school, traditional, cumbersome stuff. And those are still out there.
Absolutely. That's a preference for some of the, what you know, right? And what they're comfortable with. A lot of like leadership, like they know, like, oh, we know this model and it speaks to what we do. Like you said, survey fatigue, that are, we're going to just tend to hover around that midpoint, right? When we start to hit it, those are important kind of things to think about within tools. When we talk about tools, and what do you see now? The workplace has kind of shifted, the environment's shifting. You talked about pulse surveys. What else? Like, what other tools that we're seeing that we could use to maybe assess how effectively we're shifting culture? What are some of those techniques that we could maybe share with our listeners that they should be considering as their work is changing, and maybe the ways in terms of the instrumentation, it may be changing?
What we're seeing, and I think that the external circumstances we're all facing are just accelerating where we were going to get to anyway in terms of tools and platforms. So I see an acceleration towards app-based tools. So it's very, very portable. Carrying them around on your mobile device and being able to access a series of different assets, whether they're learning assets or assessment assets that are very targeted, very, very precise, and only looking at certain discrete behaviors as opposed to, as we said before, sort of the laundry list of competencies that you want to evaluate. That's a big trend that's accelerated because of lockdowns and the different kinds of things organizations are going through. In terms of just what we're doing right now on Zoom, obviously that's a great platform to still get some face time with people to understand their nonverbals as you talk about things like culture. So that's accelerated. And we all saw the proliferation for Zoom that they experienced in their users. And so that's just a sort of a platform that enables a lot more interaction that feels a little bit more personal than just the old-fashioned conference calls and things like that. So those are some of the things that are happening right now that are sort of accelerating the way a culture shift can be deployed, how it can be resourced through technology.
I like how you said, like, it just kind of thrust us a little bit. It was like accelerated us, right? It's like we knew we were going this direction. Yeah. It was like we're kind of pittering along. We're like, yeah, all right. And then like, oh no, you're going to go a lot faster. Just and accelerate us all to this change that we always knew was on the horizon, but we're over the horizon now, and there's no going back at this point. I think with a lot of the digital transformation stuff that we're experiencing.
I agree.
The three of us were chatting the other day, and we were talking a little bit about data too, right? So we talk about culture, the assessments, and the data side, and the way we present it to different groups. So when we do these cultural assessments and we're looking at effectiveness, how does that kind of vary across the groups? The way we present it, say to executive versus the specialist.
That's really important because as you go through these types of initiatives and you start defining the culture, defining where it needs to be, defining what you have to retain and what you absolutely have to change, that all has to get documented because that gets translated into different initiatives. So it almost becomes a roadmap, if you will, of how to get from point A to point B in your cultural journey. And that roadmap needs to take on different look and a different reporting depending on who your audience is. So for work that I've done with C-suite as well as board of directors, it has to be extraordinarily simple. If you condense all of that information and data down to one slide, and the slide itself has a graphic on it, it's not necessarily words, it could be like pictures. That seems to resonate really well. What's the really big picture? How does all this stuff relate? Using, logo and company colors and that kind of thing, so you're not tripping them up on visual cues that actually don't matter, but to them matter a lot. As you get further out into the organization, to the people who actually have to do the work, who have to, whether it's the HR team or whether it's managers, line managers and supervisors, the reports and the data have to become much more granular, much more specific, highly prescriptive in terms of recommendations. Do this, do that, and here's how we're going to implement it, here's how we're going to measure it, here's how we're going to reward for it. It has to be very, very precise. So there's sort of this continuum between highly granular types of reporting and a picture. Just a picture on a slide, pretty picture on a slide. And almost everything in between, depending on what your audience is where they reside in the organization and what they actually have to do with the cultural shift. And so a one-size-fits-all reporting structure is not good. It really needs to be customized for each audience within the organization.
Now we're kind of getting to the closing. It's a big thank you to Michael. Michael's such a wonderful practitioner. I've learned so much just in 2 days, just about culture and a little bit about how you can shift it. But Michael, now it's kind of time for you to be able to kind of shout anything out you want to and share if you have any new initiatives or new companies that you're working with.
One of the things that I would just like to say in closing, and I think this has dawned on just about everybody, that organizations are reflections of societies. And our society here is going through major shifts and major introspection. And there's a moment here in time where organizations, like the societies that they operate within, have an opportunity to really look at their culture, really look at how they're doing things. And there seems to be a catalyst in the external environment to help organizations along this line. So not only has it accelerated some of the digital platform that we all need to operate with, it's also accelerating the need to be introspective and to redefine our cultures in ways that are going to make our companies better and going to serve our clients and our customers better. So I would just emphasize that we've got sort of this unique moment in history that we could really capitalize on. And many, many organizations and many of the consultants in my network are telling me the same thing, that organizations want to get really serious about doing some much needed and long overdue culture shifts. So that's the thing that I would emphasize sort of in closing. And to thank both of you guys for the opportunity to let me talk to you a little bit about what I do. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
It was a tremendous conversation. I loved it. I love learning about it, Aaron. I know you like diving into this stuff a lot. But Michael, I appreciate it so much. We're going to sign out. William, host, Aaron, co-host, Michael, amazing. We appreciate you. Have a wonderful rest of your day.